On the 17th of May, 2005, Gary Berntsen walked out of the Central Intelligence Agency after nearly 23 years of service, handed his manuscript to the Publications Review Board, and waited for the 30 days the board's own regulations said he was owed. He had led the CIA's paramilitary operation in Afghanistan from the first weeks after the September 11th attacks through the battle that should have ended the war and did not. He had earned the agency's 2 highest decorations for field operations. He had resigned to write about what had actually happened and about what had been decided by men thousands of miles away who had never stood inside those mountains. On the 17th of June, his 30-day deadline passed. Nothing came back. On the 28th of July, his attorney filed suit in the United States District Court for Washington. When the manuscript finally returned, 98 days after submission, it arrived with 40 pages removed. Not adjusted, not condensed. Removed. Among those 40 pages were accounts of what British Special Forces soldiers saw, heard, and reported in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan in December 2001. Intelligence damaging enough to 2 governments that neither was prepared to permit its public existence. The book's opening sentence was one of the more precisely accurate statements produced by the entire Afghan war. It is a book the CIA did not want anyone to read. The chapter those 40 pages came from was something else entirely. That chapter was what the British government hoped you would never ask about. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard what British Special Forces actually did in the mountains where Osama bin Laden was cornered in December 2001? Because what you are about to discover will change how you understand Britain's war after September the 11th, and why the soldiers who came closest to ending it in the first 3 months have never been publicly acknowledged by the country that sent them. Now let's go. The Publications Review Board is not sinister by design. Every CIA officer who writes a book must submit to it. Its purpose is protection. Sources whose lives depend on their anonymity. Methods whose disclosure would compromise ongoing operations. Intelligence whose publication would endanger the people who gathered it. Review, redact, return within 30 days. What happened with Gary Berntsen's manuscript was what the system's architects had also designed it to do when political conditions required it, executed in a way not designed to be noticed. The review took 3 times as long as the board's own rules permitted. When the manuscript returned with 40 pages gone, the agency had technically satisfied the court's requirements. It had also ensured that what Berntsen had written about a particular Allied nation's contribution to the battle would not appear in any library or bookshop where a British citizen might read it. Reviewers of the published version noticed a pattern in the redactions. Figures clearly identified in other unclassified accounts of the same events are blacked out in Berntsen's text in ways that suggest targeted concern rather than general caution. The passages where British operators would have appeared, reported, and been credited with what they observed fall precisely where the black lines are densest. Not tactical intelligence whose disclosure would endanger a current source. Not operational methods whose description would advantage a future adversary. The eyewitness account of what British soldiers saw at a specific location on a specific date, and what it meant that the outcome was what it was. The mechanism that produced this outcome is older than the Afghan War. The UK-USA Intelligence Sharing Agreement, signed between the United States and the United Kingdom in 1946 and extended to Australia, Canada, and New Zealand to form the Five Eyes Alliance, governs how the 2 governments share intelligence at the foundational level. At its core is a principle known as the third-party rule. Intelligence gathered by one signatory about or with the assistance of a partner cannot be disclosed to outside parties without that partner's consent. The practical consequence at Tora Bora had the precision of a designed outcome. British operators functioning within a CIA-led command structure reported their observations as CIA intelligence. from the moment a British soldier at Tora Bora filed a report. That report belonged to the American classification system. It could not be released without mutual agreement between Washington and London. Neither capital wished to reach that agreement, and neither was formally asked to. Across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom's Defense and Security Media Advisory Committee operated as the UCRUSA mechanism's domestic counterpart, without the need for legal enforcement. Veterans of Tora Bora were not legally silenced. They were advised, continuously, and in terms that military employment structures made effectively binding, to remain so. When the BBC assembled its Radio 4 documentary in 2011, it could only do so from veterans who had already left their services. 2 governments, 2 systems, 1 outcome. What those 40 pages were protecting was not a source in the field or a method still in active use. The operation was over. What was being protected was the eyewitness story of British proximity to the most consequential failure of the war's opening months. What 2 soldiers had seen, what a voice on a captured radio had told them, and why the country that sent those soldiers to that mountain has spent 2 decades ensuring its citizens do not know what they found when they got there. The invasion of Afghanistan began on the 7th of October, 2001, built on a plan assembled in roughly 3 weeks after the September 11th attacks. In 1979, the Soviet Union had sent 100,000 soldiers into Afghanistan. It stayed 9 years. It left in defeat. The lesson, as Rumsfeld and Franks understood it, was mass. Large conventional forces gave the Mujahideen everything they needed: fixed targets, predictable supply lines, and a cause that united men who would otherwise have been fighting each other. What they designed instead was its structural opposite: small, highly mobile teams of CIA paramilitary officers and special operations soldiers working alongside Afghan opposition fighters, guided from the ground by operators with laser designators and GPS equipment linked to aircraft that could place a 2,000-pound bomb within 10 meters of a transmitted coordinate. General Franks put a ceiling of 10,000 American troops in the country. In 10 weeks, the plan swept the Taliban from every city they had held, at the cost of 30 American lives. The military analyst Michael O'Hanlon described it as a masterpiece of creativity and finesse. He added one qualifier: that it had failed to accomplish its most concrete political goal by not killing or capturing Osama bin Laden. The flaw was about to determine the next decade. Britain was the most committed American ally in this effort, and its commitment had institutional consequences that extended beyond the political. British special forces were embedded in American operational structures within weeks of the invasion. They served under CENTCOM's authority and under the Joint Task Force architecture that combined American and British operators into integrated units. Their reports went into American classification systems. Their treaty obligations became variables in an American war plan, and their presence in the operation would eventually become the one element of it that neither government wished to explain. On the 10th of November, 2001, CIA surveillance spotted bin Laden's convoy moving east toward Jalalabad. Approximately 200 pickup trucks heading toward the White Mountains, with the deliberate speed of men who knew exactly where they were going. Dick Cheney confirmed on the 29th of November that bin Laden was believed to be in the general area, surrounded by a substantial protective force. The destination was a complex whose name in Pashto translates as Black Dust or Black Cave, that bin Laden had helped build while fighting the Soviets in the 1980s, and whose every trail he had been memorizing on long hikes with his children for 15 years. On the 21st of November, 2001, President Bush drew Rumsfeld aside as they left a National Security Council meeting and told him to begin planning the invasion of Iraq. Franks was at his desk in Tampa working on air support arrangements for the forces gathering below the mountain complex. Within days, intelligence and planning resources began moving from Afghanistan toward the Iraq assessment. A slow leak, not a dramatic reallocation. At the end of November, Hank Crumpton flew to Washington. He was the CIA's head of special operations for its counterterrorism division. He went to the White House and briefed the president and vice president directly. He put Tora Bora on the map, described the caves and the connecting passages, and said the Afghan militia the military was relying on was tired, cold, and not invested in getting bin Laden. The president asked him directly whether the Afghan forces were up to the job. Definitely not, Mr. President. Definitely not. The warning reached the most senior levels of American government in the clearest language from the officer best placed to deliver it. The decision did not change. The Afghan militias and the Pakistani border forces would carry the main operational weight. What followed at Tora Bora was not an intelligence failure. It was the documented, foreseen consequence of a decision made by men who had been told precisely what the consequences would be. The British soldiers who arrived in Afghanistan in the autumn of 2001 were among the best trained in the world, deployed to exactly the environment their selection process and doctrine had been constructed for. 2 full squadrons of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, A Squadron and G Squadron, approximately 120 men, flew to northwest Afghanistan in mid-October under a mission that described its own ambitions with unintended precision. Operation Determine sent the SAS to conduct reconnaissance and bomb damage assessment. 2 weeks of patrols, no enemy contact. Both squadrons returned to the United Kingdom. The regiment had been deployed to a conflict in precisely the operating environment, where its training made it almost uniquely capable. The constraint was institutional rather than physical. CENTCOM had not cleared British forces for direct action, and without direct action authority, 2 squadrons of the British Army's finest infantry became reconnaissance assets attached to a war being shaped by CIA cash and American air power. Tony Blair changed that. Following political pressure from Downing Street, both squadrons were covertly reinserted into Bagram Airfield under the codename Operation Blood and given a direct action task. They were going to be allowed to fight. The target was an al-Qaeda compound approximately 190 miles southwest of Kandahar, 12 miles north of the Pakistan border, at the foot of a mountain called Khoi Malik. Intelligence assessed it as being used simultaneously as an opium processing facility, a command headquarters, and a staging base for fighters moving across the border. Between 80 and 100 foreign fighters, predominantly al-Qaeda, were defending it. This was not a soft compound in a remote location. It was a defended position at the edge of Pakistan, held by men with combat experience and open fields of observation across the desert floor in every direction. What the regiment did on that desert floor was the largest operation the Special Air Service had conducted since the Second World War. An 8-man Pathfinder team from G Squadron's air troop parachuted into the Registan Desert the night before the main assault, using a high-altitude low-opening insertion to arrive without detection and to mark a temporary landing zone for the C-130 Hercules transports, bringing the main force. Approximately 120 operators landed and moved in 36 heavily armed vehicles from the landing zone to the forming-up position. The assault went in during daylight, against a prepared enemy position in open desert terrain that offered almost nothing in the way of concealment. 4 SAS soldiers were wounded, none fatally. A squadron cleared the headquarters building and removed 2 laptops and a substantial quantity of operational documentation whose intelligence value would become apparent in the months that followed, driving coalition strikes on al-Qaeda targets across Afghanistan in ways never attributed to the men who retrieved the material. The lowest estimate of enemy killed is 18. Other accounts place the figure considerably higher. 5 decorations were issued: 1 Distinguished Service Order, 2 Military Crosses, 2 Conspicuous Gallantry Crosses. They were issued in records the regiment's operations kept from public view, for an action the British public did not know had taken place. The strategic significance of the facility, official records state, has never been fully explained. Operation Trent, the largest SAS action since the Second World War, not recorded on any monument in Britain. While A and G squadrons were fighting in the southern desert, the British Special Forces Unit, whose operations would produce the war's most sensitive suppressed intelligence, was following a different trail in the mountains of the east, toward the observations that 40 pages of black lines would later be deployed to conceal. The Special Boat Service is the Royal Navy's Special Forces Regiment, based at Poole on the Dorset coast. Where the SAS is defined by endurance selection and mountain movement, the SBS builds its institutional identity around the skills that maritime operations require: closed-circuit diving, small boat insertion, the sustained covert positioning that water enables, the patience of operators trained to wait in conditions of prolonged discomfort for the precise moment the situation demands. In late November 2001, C Squadron flew into Bagram Airfield and found a situation nobody had briefed them to expect. Northern Alliance troops garrisoning Bagram had not been told a British Special Forces squadron was arriving. A confrontation developed between soldiers who shared no language and had been given no preparation for each other's presence. Frantic liaison work by British and American officers resolved it before it became irrevocable. The episode illustrated the coalition's governing operational problem: partners sharing space without adequate coordination, where any misunderstanding carried the potential to become permanent. With Bagram secured, C Squadron dispersed into fire teams of 4 to 6 operators, each self-sufficient, each capable of independent operation across extended periods. 12 of those operators and 10 officers from the Secret Intelligence Service were assigned to the operation gathering east of Jalalabad. Gary Bernson's Jawbreaker team had established a command post in an abandoned schoolhouse in the foothills below the White Mountains. The CIA's intelligence picture had been assembled through multiple methods, including a network of local villagers paid to provide information, given rudimentary GPS devices, and instructed to press a button wherever they observed significant concentrations of fighters. When those villagers returned for their payments, the coordinates recorded in those devices were transmitted to aircraft overhead within minutes. The coalition also had to confront the gap between what it expected at Tora Bora and what was actually there. Western media had described the complex as a multi-story underground facility with a hospital, a hydroelectric power plant, rooms carved 350 feet into granite, roads wide enough for tanks. When coalition forces moved through the complex, they found natural caves. Most were barely large enough for a man to stand upright. There was no hospital. The fortress was a myth. What the complex possessed was a system of connecting passages whose geography only the men who had built them fully understood, and centuries of accumulated local knowledge about which trails through the mountains led to Pakistan. The geography was real, and the men defending it had been learning it since before any Western soldier had found it on a map. When British operators integrated into the schoolhouse structure, their intelligence moved up the chain as American intelligence. This was the automatic operation of classification protocols designed into the alliance long before any of these men had been born. The structure that enabled the two countries to share intelligence had enclosed what British soldiers were about to witness inside a vault that required both countries' consent to open. Neither would offer that consent. On the 8th of December, 2001, the force that would come closest to killing Osama bin Laden arrived at the schoolhouse. Not the 1,200 Marines whose commander had assessed they could seal the mountain passes. Not the 800 Army Rangers Gary Burnson had formally requested and been denied. Not the several thousand troops whose deployment CENTCOM had modeled and set aside. 40 Delta Force operators under the command of a major known in subsequent accounts by the pseudonym Dalton Fury, and whose real name was Thomas Harder Greer of Alexandria, Virginia, who had started as a Ranger instructor in the mid-1980s, who had transferred to Delta Force and given more than 20 years to high-value target operations. Greer's team wore traditional Afghan clothing. Their beards had been accumulating since the deployment began. They carried the weapons the Afghan militia carried. Embedded with Delta's A Squadron were 2 operators from M Squadron of the Special Boat Service. Their names appear in no public record. Their contribution appears in those 40 pages. Within days of arrival, a CIA operative retrieved a shortwave radio from the body of a dead al-Qaeda fighter on the mountain. In material terms, it was salvage. In intelligence terms, it was a direct, unencrypted channel into al-Qaeda's internal command network, available in real time. Through it, the coalition heard fighters reporting positions, calling for medical assistance, describing the effect of the bombing. Then they heard a voice that Greer later described as transforming the character of everything. The CIA had deployed with the operation a specialist known by the operational name Jalal, an officer who had spent 7 years studying Osama bin Laden's spoken Arabic, his cadences, his word choices, the rhetorical habits of his speeches and private recordings. When the voice came through the captured radio, Jalal's identification was immediate. A second Delta Force officer who had independently studied bin Laden's speech before the deployment confirmed independently that the match was perfect. The coalition had live audio confirmation that bin Laden was inside the mountains above them, close enough that his transmissions reached a radio taken from one of his dead. On the 9th of December, a 15,000-pound bomb known as a daisy cutter, a weapon not deployed since Vietnam and so large it had to be rolled out the back of a C-130 cargo aircraft, was dropped on the complex. A captured al-Qaeda fighter, interrogated afterward, described men deep in caves being destroyed by what he called a hideous explosion. The bombing continued. The radio continued to deliver its running account of what the bombing was doing to the men inside. Calls for help moving the wounded, transmissions about cave positions that had become too hot to remain in, the movements of fighters under sustained fire. Through the first days, bin Laden's voice on the radio carried the register of a commander under pressure, but not yet broken. By the second week, something had shifted. He apologized to his men for getting them trapped and pounded. He told them it was acceptable to surrender. He had let them down. The voice that Jalal had spent 7 years studying was audible in a frequency that everyone at the schoolhouse recognized, not defeat as resignation, but a man measuring the distance between what he had expected at this place and what was actually happening. The SBS observation post filed a report that was relayed to Burnson's command element and subsequently processed into the CIA's archive. 2 operators, watching through their optics, observed a tall figure in a camouflage jacket, moving with a protective detail of approximately 50 armed men toward a section of cliff face they identified as containing a concealed entrance. Not the cave openings the bombing had been targeting, but a hidden one used by men who had memorized the complex's less visible geography across years of preparation. The figure entered. 6 bombs were called down on that entrance. This is what the 40 pages contained. Greer's team advanced to within approximately 2,000 meters of the position before withdrawing, uncertain of the fighter concentration between the team and the target, without the Afghan militia support that the nightly Ramadan descent to the villages below had made habitually absent. On the 10th of December, intercepted communications indicated bin Laden was attempting to move through the siege line. Afghan soldiers reported having him surrounded. Further intercepts placed him at approximately 10 kilometers from the nearest Delta element. The team was engaged in a firefight elsewhere. The Afghan allies had gone home for the night. Thomas Greer said in the years that followed that this period represented the deepest professional regret of his life. He had proposed every tactical solution available to him and been refused each one. He could hear his target's voice on a radio in his hand. The chain of command above him had decided, for reasons that derived from doctrine and diplomacy, that what he needed would not be sent. Greer had submitted his first proposal before the main fighting reached its peak. Cross the 14,000-foot ridgeline from the Pakistani side with supplemental oxygen. Insert above and behind bin Laden's position. Approach from the rear, while everything he was defending against came from in front. It was rejected somewhere in the hierarchy between the schoolhouse and CENTCOM headquarters in Florida. No explanation was ever publicly provided. His second proposal was less dramatic and, in the assessment of multiple analysts who have subsequently studied the battle, more likely to have changed the outcome. The Gator mine system delivers scatterable anti-personnel and anti-tank mines from aircraft, seeding a defined area at a density that makes crossing it on foot extremely dangerous. The passes south of Tora Bora toward Pakistan were finite, identifiable from the air, and open at night when the Afghan militia had gone home and no coalition ground presence contested them. Air-dropped mines across those passes required no one to hold them. The first man through would stop the men behind him. Aircraft above would detect the heat signatures of the group and engage. General Richard Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, confirmed the denial. He said simply that it was not how mines were used. This has stood as the sufficient explanation in most accounts. It should not. The United Kingdom signed the Ottawa Treaty, formally the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines, on the 3rd of December, 1997, and ratified it on the 31st of July, 1998. The ratification carried the weight of national political commitment alongside legal obligation, connected in British public consciousness to Princess Diana's campaign against landmines in the months before her death that year. Germany, whose Kommando Spezialkraft operators were at Tora Bora alongside the SBS and Delta Force, had also ratified. The United States had not. Article 1 of the Ottawa Treaty prohibits signatory states from using anti-personnel mines and from assisting, encouraging, or inducing anyone to engage in activities the treaty prohibits. If the United States, with British and German operators embedded in the Joint Command that had formally requested the mines, had airdropped Gator systems across the Tora Bora passes, the legal argument that Britain had facilitated a prohibited activity was not frivolous. It was precisely the scenario Article 1 had been drafted to prevent. The BBC Radio 4 documentary noted carefully that some believe the rejection came after pressure from the British. The Australian Army's published operational analysis states it directly. The Gator proposal was denied because Allies threatened to leave the war due to anti-landmine treaties they were members of. Thomas Greer named the Allies' treaty obligations as one of his 3 explanations for why bin Laden escaped. He was not speculating. He was reporting a decision communicated to him as final. The mine proposal was not the only one refused. Brigadier General James Mattis, commanding more than 1,200 Marines outside Kandahar, told a journalist directly that his force could seal the mountain passes and had been told it would not be moved to do so. A battalion of 800 Rangers was positioned in Oman. Bernsen's formal CIA request for them had been denied by CENTCOM. A plan to insert several thousand troops from the mountain's rear had been modeled and set aside. 4 proposals from different commanders through different chains of command, each denied by the same authority at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. Not a capability gap, not an absence of creative thinking, A pattern of refusals applied consistently to every suggestion that more American force be committed to the specific task of killing the man responsible for September the 11th. The Afghan model that had swept the Taliban from power in 10 weeks could not close 14,000-foot mountain passes at night. The men who could close those passes were not sent. On the afternoon of the 11th of December, 2001, Mohammed Zaman approached the American position and told Thomas Greer the battle was over. Al-Qaeda fighters wanted to surrender. All they required was a 12-hour ceasefire to descend from the mountains and lay down their weapons. The intercepted radio traffic seemed, on its surface, to support this. An American soldier who heard the intercepts described them in a BBC interview as communicating that doom was coming. Zaman said it was the greatest day in the history of Afghanistan because Al-Qaeda was no more and bin Laden was finished. Greer asked why he was finished. Because he had let them down, Zaman said. Gary Burnson was at the command post when the ceasefire proposal reached him. He communicated, in terms the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's account renders, with official restraint, that there would be no ceasefire, no negotiation, that airstrikes would continue. CENTCOM declined to endorse a complete cessation, but agreed to a partial overnight pause in bombing. That concession was the only operational requirement for what came next. Through the night of the 11th into the 12th of December, Al-Qaeda fighters moved south through the passes in darkness. Intelligence assembled afterward put the number at as many as 800 men. Moving through the terrain the mines had not been dropped to close. Through the border zone, the Frontier Corps had not deployed in adequate numbers to seal. By the morning of the 12th, not a single fighter had appeared below to surrender. Delta Force had not fully honored the truce. Greer's account describes his team bombing Al-Qaeda positions at 5 in the morning, 3 hours before the ceasefire was scheduled to expire. A U.S. Air Force pilot expressed the sentiment of the men at the schoolhouse more personally. Skywriting above the mountain passes, in letters visible from the ground, a figure 8 followed by the word on. Not strategy, not any military consequence. The statement of a man who understood what was being permitted and whose only available form of protest was aerobatics. On the 13th of December, fighting resumed. A rear guard of Al-Qaeda's most committed fighters held the cave positions, while the main body's movement south continued. The captured radio delivered bin Laden's final transmissions across the course of the 13th. In the afternoon, a declaration that the time had come to arm his followers' families against the invaders. Then silence. Then, several hours later, words conveying that prayers had gone unanswered, that the nations who called themselves Muslim brothers had provided no support, and that things might have been different. Then, in the evening, the transmission Greer said stayed with him, an apology to his men for involving them in the battle, and a statement that those who could no longer resist had his blessing to surrender. These were not the words of a man who had concluded his situation was terminal. They were the words of a man completing obligations to the people he was leaving behind. On the 14th of December, bin Laden wrote his will. He apologized to his children for having devoted his life to jihad rather than to them. He told his wives not to remarry. He wrote in the language of a man who genuinely expected to die within days. He had been at Tora Bora since late November. He had survived more than 50 airstrikes. He had written his will. He had said his goodbyes. And then he did not die. Bin Laden's departure is dated by most assessments to approximately the 15th of December, 2001. Two groups of Al-Qaeda fighters descended the southern slopes of the White Mountains toward Pakistan's tribal areas in a movement that had been planned and financed before the bombing had begun. The money that opened the passes had been distributed weeks earlier. Pakistan's Frontier Corps occupied the tribal belt thinly expensively, with authority that extended as far as the nearest road and no further. Drone footage from this period, described by intelligence sources who reviewed it in subsequent years, showed Pakistani soldiers at border crossings accepting payments from men moving south. The recordings exist. They have never been released. One account introduces an explanation that has never been confirmed and has never been definitively dismissed. The journalist Sean Naylor documented that a U.S. Special Operations soldier had observed Pakistani military helicopters making brief landings inside Afghanistan near the border before returning immediately to Pakistan. Some Delta members concluded Pakistan was providing aerial extraction rather than merely ground passage. The Pakistani government has not addressed the question. On the 15th of December, the CIA's Jawbreaker team intercepted what they assessed as a farewell address. The voice Jalal had been identifying for a week, addressing the remaining fighters on the mountain for what both sides of the transmission appear to have understood was the last time. After that transmission, the captured radio went silent. Hazrat Ali declared victory on the 17th of December. The complex had been taken. The approximately 20 prisoners displayed briefly to international media were thin, exhausted men who looked nothing like the formidable fighters Western coverage had been describing. The caves held emptied positions, Soviet-era equipment, and the residue of 3 weeks of sustained bombardment. No body, no outcome. Thomas Greer walked up to the last known position in cold weather, with rain coming in from the west, through what he described as a strange mixture of sand and dirt created by 3 weeks of air power ground out of the mountain stone. Afghan fighters came up alongside him and told him Osama had gone to Pakistan and they were going home. They turned and walked down the mountain. Task Force 11 was formally inactivated on the 19th of December. British UKSF elements were released from the Joint Command structure. On the 27th of December, bin Laden released a video. He was alive, visibly diminished, with movements analysts characterized as consistent with injuries to the left side of his body. He had walked out of the mountains on the trails he had memorized on long hikes with his children during years when none of this had yet begun. The first public claim contradicting the documented record came from Tommy Franks on the 19th of October, 2004, when he wrote in the New York Times that the intelligence about bin Laden's location had been inconclusive. He had said the opposite on the 7th of January, 2002, when he told a reporter that bin Laden had been there. The reversal occurred 11 days before a presidential election. It had no additional factual basis. 2 weeks later, his CENTCOM deputy during the war provided the most clarifying official statement the episode would produce. Lieutenant General Michael DeLong had written in his published memoir that September that the coalition had been tracking bin Laden closely and that he had unquestionably been present when the caves were hit, and that Rumsfeld asked him daily throughout the bombing whether they had succeeded. In November of that same year, DeLong wrote a newspaper opinion piece arguing that bin Laden had probably never been at Tora Bora at all. When Senate staff asked him to reconcile the two accounts, DeLong said the real reason American troops had not been committed was that the election of an interim Afghan government had not yet occurred. The administration had wanted Afghanistan stable for Karzai's installation. Political management of an allied government's transition had taken precedence over killing the man responsible for September the 11th. The Bush administration maintained its uncertainty about bin Laden's presence at Tora Bora for 3 years and 4 months against a Delta Force ground commander who had been there, a CIA paramilitary commander who had been there, a second senior CIA officer who had been there, 2 independent voice identifications, Afghan villager testimony, and a Pentagon detention summary that described its subject as having assisted in bin Laden's escape from Tora Bora. The Special Operations Command's official history, published in 2007, recorded the conclusion without ceremony. All source reporting had corroborated bin Laden's presence on several days from the 9th to the 14th of December. It was published without a press release, without a briefing, without any particular marking to distinguish it from routine record-keeping, available to anyone who sought it. Read in the immediate period of its publication by almost no one. The classification of the British role at Tora Bora operated through 5 institutional mechanisms that worked simultaneously. The first was the command structure. British UKSF within Task Force 11 were subject to JSOC's highest classification tier, requiring no additional decision to protect what British soldiers reported within it. The second was treaty-based. The UK-USA third-party rule made British intelligence entering CIA channels classifiable under American protocols and required mutual consent that neither government sought to provide. The third was the Ottawa Treaty connection, the implication that British participation had been a factor in the rejection of the mine barrier was a finding neither government was prepared to acknowledge. The fourth was evidentiary. The SBS sighting, processed as CIA intelligence, would have made the failure irrefutable with British eyewitness testimony, transforming what the administration had spent years calling an intelligence uncertainty into a documented, witnessed, accountable failure. The fifth was institutional. The DSMA's advisory system operated as a practical prohibition whose absence of legal force made no practical difference to its effect. Neither government told the British public that British soldiers had heard bin Laden on a captured radio, that British operators had observed him entering a cave, that their presence in the operation had carried treaty obligations that may have prevented the mine barrier, or that the intelligence they gathered had been withheld under American protocols from the moment it was reported. The archive closed around what British soldiers had witnessed. The BBC Radio 4 documentary from 2011, assembled from veterans who had already left their services, offered the first partial reconstruction of events. The 2 SBS operators who watched the tall man in the camouflage jacket enter the hidden cave entrance in December 2001 have never been publicly identified. Their names have never appeared in print. Their contribution to the most consequential intelligence gathered at the war's most important battle has never been acknowledged by the government that sent them there. The consequences of December 2001 arrived quickly. Al-Qaeda's leadership reached Pakistan's tribal belt and began reconstructing its operational infrastructure within weeks. Rebuilding in the geography, the coalition had failed to seal everything the campaign had been intended to destroy. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee concluded in 2009 that bin Laden's survival had allowed the organization to re-emerge as a force attracting resources and inspiring violence in ways not possible had its leadership been eliminated at Tora Bora. On the 7th of July, 2005, 52 people were killed and approximately 700 were wounded in coordinated bomb attacks on London's underground railway and bus system. The bombers were British citizens who had trained in camps affiliated with Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, in the tribal belt where the organization had reconstituted itself after the mountains. The link between the decision made at CENTCOM in November 2001 and the bombs that killed 52 people on London transport in July 2005 was not speculation. It was the documented consequence of a documented decision. 453 British military personnel were killed in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014. British combat troops left in October of that year, 13 years after the invasion that was supposed to last 3. The Senate committee called the failure at Tora Bora a lost opportunity that forever altered the course of the conflict and the future of international terrorism. 453 names, 13 years, an altered course. Cove Black had been the CIA's director of counterterrorism when the battle was fought. He said years later that committing the forces that Crumpton and Burnson and Mattis and Greer had been requesting would have been well worth it, compared against a decade of subsequent fighting. He said that if he could have had one wish in the aftermath, it would have been to stand up from his desk and call the president himself. He had not stood up. Thomas Harter Greer, Major, United States Army, retired, who published under the pseudonym Dalton Fury because the Department of Defense's review required it, who appeared on national television in prosthetic makeup because a legal ruling held that acknowledging his connection to Delta Force operations posed a national security risk, who graduated from Mount Vernon High School in Alexandria, Virginia in 1982, who was a member of Sand Grove Baptist Church, whose proudest achievement, his family said, was being a father to his 2 daughters, who donated every dollar of his book's proceeds to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, which funds the university education of the children of special operators killed in action, died on the 21st of October, 2016, of pancreatic cancer at the age of 52. He was never publicly honored for what he did at Tora Bora. The Department of Defense reviewed and approved the book describing it, under its conditions, in a version that does not include his name. Operation Trent, the SAS's largest action since the Second World War, 120 soldiers and 36 vehicles in a daylight assault on a prepared al-Qaeda compound, from which 2 laptops were retrieved, whose intelligence drove coalition operations for months. 5 decorations for unnamed men for an operation the British public does not know occurred, has never been publicly commemorated in the United Kingdom. The strategic significance of the facility, official records maintain, has never been fully explained. In August 2010, American intelligence found bin Laden living in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, less than a mile from the Pakistan Military Academy. He had been there for at least 5 years. On the 2nd of May, 2011, United States Navy SEALs killed him in a raid on the compound. He died in a bedroom. The hunt that had begun in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan 9 years and 4 months before ended in a building. British combat troops left Afghanistan in October 2014. The United States withdrew in August 2021. The Taliban retook the country in 11 days. Tora Bora fell without a fight. The complex where British operators had heard a voice on a radio and watched a tall figure enter a hidden cave entrance returned to the organization that had built it, and whose leader had walked out of it 20 years before, while the men closest to him had no authority to act. The CIA withheld the British role at Tora Bora through 5 institutional mechanisms that each reveal something about the relationship between the 2 governments. The command structure that enclosed British intelligence inside American classification by default. The Five Eyes third-party rule that required consent neither capital sought to provide. The Ottawa Treaty implication that neither government could comfortably acknowledge. The evidentiary weight of SBS testimony that would have made the failure irrefutable. And the systems of both governments that maintained silence without requiring a single deliberate decision to do so. The distance between what British soldiers witnessed at Tora Bora and what the British public was told about it is the distance in which the real origins of the Afghan war, its specific preventability, its precise moment of failure, the cost it carried into the years that followed, are written, and have been written, behind classification markings since the 19th of December, 2001. 2 SBS operators heard Osama bin Laden's voice on a captured radio and watched a tall man in a camouflage jacket with a 50-man protective detail disappear into a hidden cave entrance in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Their names have never been published. Their contribution has never been acknowledged by the country that sent them. What they saw set the terms of 20 years of subsequent war, and it is not on any monument in London. Thomas Harter Greer donated his proceeds to the children of dead special operators, wore a disguise on national television rather than show a face the government could not permit to be public, and died at 52 with his Tora Bora citation still in a classified file. He was never given a ceremony. He was never given a public name. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, the ones whose names we know and the ones whose names remain in the archive, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand how the decision to look away from one war and toward the next determined everything that came after, watch this next.